So when they actually asked them what they were threatened by, and of course we have the whole gamut. So you have people who are low on the scale, all the way up to people who are high on that authoritarianism scale. And you're asking them, how much of a threat do you think this is? Is it good for America? Is it bad for America? Jamie should know all these questions now intimately. The idea of, can everybody make it? Can the average person make it in the economy? Are you going to be better off than your parents were? Those kinds of issues. Is it good or bad for America for Muslims to be building mosques in US cities? Those kinds of things. That we find that people who perceive these more of a threat tend to also have higher authoritarianism scales. And then also their actions. This is 2016 data that we're looking at here, that they're much more supportive of building a wall, those that have higher authoritarianism scores, as well as they are much more likely to want to use force than diplomacy, as well as they actually want more government surveillance. And even there was, one of the studies had a question to say, do you think that everyone should carry an ID card that the police can ask you for at any time? And the high authoritarian folks were really high on that scale. So that, yeah, it's a little scary. So there's definitely something to this, and that's being talked about a lot. So that's a very interesting thing, of way to kind of analyze and be looking at the Trump phenomenon in particular, which there was a strong correlation between high, as we see up there, with those who are higher on the scale being more supportive of Trump, but also people who are threatened by these things and want these kinds of policies are definitely more for Trump than those who are not. Okay, another interesting part, and this is maybe the broader definition, not necessarily like, all right, ideologically we're moving apart, but why are we pulling apart from each other? And there's a theory out there called social polarization, and this is taken from social psych, which is kind of the team mentality idea. And that is, people have an identity with a party. As that identity grows, their sort of fear and stereotyping of the other, in this case we're meaning the other party, also grows. So we've seen this over time, and what we find here is realignment is this issue that we talked about with as particularly the Southern Democrats became more Republican. And what we found over time, and this has a lot of agreement to it, is that rather than people changing their viewpoints, they're just migrating to the different parties. So whereas, as we know, in the 80s and the 1990s, there were a lot, particularly in the Northeast, Republicans in the Northeast were pretty liberal. Senator Chafee was quintessentially sort of a liberal Republican. Olympia Snowe from Maine. And those folks have retired in large part. Similarly, the conservative Democrats, Joe Lieberman from Connecticut, also retired. That a lot of those folks that were, again, where they were liberal Republicans or conservative Democrats, have all now either retired, died, or migrated to the other party. So what we're finding is that this realignment is one of the reasons why people differ so much from others. And the argument from this study that's been done is to say that homogeneity now within the party, because almost everybody in the Republican Party are conservatives, and everybody in the Democratic Party are liberals. But there isn't as much of that sort of cross-identification pressure. That cohesiveness is one of the reasons she argues is driving not so much issue differences as much as the hating thing, because it's sort of a team mentality. Okay. So it's kind of an interesting thing. There's not been a lot of empirical evidence of this, but it's kind of an interesting theory that's separated from these ideological differences to talk about why people might be so mad at each other, is that broader definition of polarization. There's one other thing that's related to that. It's called political warfare. And this is, to me, I think is these folks aren't talking to each other. They think of themselves as being sort of separate phenomena. But what was interesting, they actually, and this article was published a couple of years ago, but it actually uses Ted Cruz as one of the examples and compares him to his fellow senator from Texas, John Cornyn, as when they are looked at in terms of their ideological scores, meaning how they vote when they're in Congress on those roll call votes, they are very, very similar ideologically. But the way that they carry themselves and practice their politics when they're in Congress couldn't be more different. This article talks about how John Cornyn comes with a pad of paper and pencil ready to sort of make a deal and negotiate, even though he could be very different, have a very different view from other people, whereas Ted Cruz comes in with a battle plan. And we know that's even a problem within his own party. Paul Ryan does not like him. We know that. He's been pretty obvious about that. He's much quieter about that now. But in the past, the establishment, mainstream part of the Republican Party, not a big Cruz fan, in large part because of this. The question is that ideologically driven, or is it some sort of strategic notion? We don't know, but it's interesting. But the argument from this author is that that's really a distinct sort of phenomenon from ideological differences. So they're arguing that we really need to broaden the way that we think about polarization rather than just assuming that it's ideological difference, which again, there's really no agreement as to how much the public is polarized. But there are also these other phenomena like social polarization and this sort of political warfare too. So I'll just show you something really quick from my stuff. Generally what we find is that the knee-jerk and job approval ratings are very, very high polarization, whereas some of the economic issues have high levels of polarization. But notice cultural issues, and I'll show you an example of both healthcare and abortion, that have much lower levels of polarization. So what you see here is, this is just during the Obama administration, is to look at, it's a measure of polarization by just looking at the approval rating differences between Democrats and Republicans. And these are survey respondents who are doing this, so this is the public who are talking about this. So as we move up, what this means is that we're actually, during just the Obama administration, we're becoming more polarized. So the approval ratings, for example, peaked in the spring of 2013 with 90% of Democrats saying that they approved of the job Obama was doing versus 10% of Republicans. That's a lot of polarization. So that's what that sort of 90 score means, is hugely polarized, that the difference between them is huge. So bear that scale in mind, as that's how big that scale is. We see it also, this is just governors' approval ratings over time. You can see the intensity of their approval and disapproval between the parties is growing over time. Let's get to this one. This is our healthcare question. The way that we asked it, by the way, was Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. There's been really interesting studies that split their sample and ask half the sample using the term Affordable Care Act and the other half using Obamacare, and the answers are very different. Not surprisingly, the Obamacare version was much more polarized than the Affordable Care Act was. We use both, but you can see the polarization scores there are high on the general approval of that. Then when you look at pre-existing conditions, look how low, for example, the polarization score is on that. There's high approval among both Democrats and Republicans in the details of it. Okay, so what we find, this is what we find sort of in general, is to say that the knee-jerk or sort of general question is pretty highly polarized. The favorability and job approval ratings for our politicians, very highly polarized. But when we ask about details of even stuff like healthcare, which is, for all intents and purposes, obviously is, you just talk about it in general, is very polarized. But when you get into the details of it, it's not as much. But here's the scores on different kinds of, under different conditions under which abortion would happen. And look at those polarization scores. Again, remember the peak in job approval rating for the president was 8%. So much, much lower. And basically what this means by having these scores be relatively low in polarization is that most people think that abortion should be legal, particularly if the woman's life is endangered. As it gets more difficult, right, to agree with for some folks, you actually find that down here too, pretty low polarization, is that most people think you should not be allowed to have an abortion under those circumstances. Both Democrats and Republicans. So the problem with asking questions like, are you for or against abortion, hides all of this subtlety. And that's really important, and that's kind of where I am poking my finger into the polarization literature. So I'm still kind of feel like I'm at the very beginning of this project. It feels enormous to me, but I'm really, really grateful to have had the time to do a sabbatical to at least dip my toe in a little bit and try to sort of make some sense out of what this literature even looks like, much less kind of where I might fit in and some of my ideas might fit in. So thank you very much for coming. And if anybody has any questions, you can, it's 2:30, but you can ask me afterwards. I'm happy to answer questions. So thank you. Thank you.